Hello and welcome everybody, I'm OneProperVariant and this is number 31 of the CK3 Dev Diaries. Today we're going to be talking about a stressful situation. This means we're going to be talking about one of the most anticipated mechanics and one of the most anticipated Dev Diaries, at least from my point of view here, because this stress mechanic is a huge expansion on what exists in CK2. Today we're going to be talking about stress itself, of course, then mental breakdowns and coping mechanisms, all of which are incredibly interesting because they refine a system that already somewhat exists in CK2, and I say somewhat very explicitly. Because in CK2, if you have played the game, if you haven't played the game, you should also understand what I'm talking about. You effectively get a number of traits. In a life, it's not really that uncommon to pick up about maybe, 16 traits. A lot of traits, like so many traits. Lifestyle traits, normal traits, character traits, wounds, etc, etc. But all of those, effectively, there are so many of them that at some point you will have trouble, being the character that you were meant to be. And the problem with that is that CK2 even goes one step further. There is a soft cap. I think it's 4 traits that your character is supposed to have. And every now and again, if you have more than 4 traits, your character will go, oh, you know what? I'm no longer zealous. I just noticed I hate being zealous. Sometimes your character will just randomly go, oh, being patient? Nah, not me. Oh, diligence? Nah, I'm good. So the game would make your character a different one at random. And that is painful because that takes away player agency that is thoroughly needed in a player agency game like Crusader Kings. So that is one of the drawbacks that already exists. But there is also somewhat of a stress mechanic in CK3. You will know this if you sometimes pick the rulership focus, that's the word. Which you, by the way, shouldn't really do. It's not that great a focus. But if you pick the rulership focus, you will run into situations where there will just be an event and that event says, I'm stressed now, or I'm depressed now. As you can see, a lot of randomness. Sometimes when you do something that is against a character, for example, if you're kind and then you torture prisoners, you will lose the kind trait and you will pick up, for example, the cruel trait. But most of the time, it doesn't really change how you play. It doesn't really impact it that much. Your character means a lot on paper, but in practice can be ignored many, many times. Now, the thing about this is that when we learned that in CK3 you would only have 2 to 3 character traits on average on a character, we all went, including myself, went, wait a minute, is that right? Is that really how it should be? But I will tell you straight up, and we will see this via the stress mechanic, since the traits that you have in CK3 truly define you, different from how it works in CK2, it works splendidly with a stress mechanic. Instead of being random like in CK2, like I just detailed it, you will have a stress mechanic that you as a player can very actively interact with. And that is true for role players, but also for min-maxers, because every player and every character will be different. Every time you jump into the game, your experience with the stress system will be different in comparison to CK2, where essentially, effectively, sometimes a character would just change, sometimes they would just become stressed, sometimes they would be like, oh, I'm no longer stressed. Very nice. CK3 gives you way more agency, whether you're a min-maxer or a role player. Let's take a look at why that is and how they do it. Stress is a representation of a character's mental well-being. As characters accumulate stress, they will increase up their stress level, with each level causing increasing penalties to their health and fertility values. The levels go 1 to 3 and of course increase in severity. You can see right now this is maxed out. Essentially, you can see this 3 indicator right here as well. You can see the bar that goes from 0 to 100, or in this case, level that you started at to next level, so 300 to 400. When you reach 400, you will suffer a mental breakdown, lose 100 stress, but the mental breakdown is something that can be quite severe. Let's talk about that in a bit. Now, the interesting thing here is that the fertility and health negative here are huge if you are level 3, but they also scale, so level 1 of course impacts you fairly barely. In CK2 that wasn't the case. In CK2 you just got the stress trait and you were stressed, period. I want to point out, before we talk about the different stress levels and how they impact your character, are you seeing this? Oh my god, so she got tortured, I can tell you that much already, because we will learn that she was in prison. I assume that Heinrich was quite brutal to us. This doesn't look too good, or maybe this was in a battle, I can't quite tell. But this is Matilda, of course, Duchess Matilda, and she didn't have a good time. And I will tell you that this scar, or rather this wound at this point, I suppose, on her face, oh my god, how did they do it this well? There is no mod, and there are no face packs in CK2 that reach this level of detail and of real looking wounds as CK3 does it. I'm very impressed by this. Now let's move on and let's examine how the different stress levels really impact our gameplay. The primary way that characters gain stress is when the demands of the realm force them to take actions which go against their nature. For example, a compassionate character will gain stress for executing prisoners in the dungeon, even if those prisoners were traitorous rebels or inconveniently positioned in the line of succession. Now, before we move to this, I want to point out, again, we will only have, on average, you can have more, but there will be a bit of a soft cap included, you will have about 2 to 3 character traits on each character. What is important is that a character that does not have the compassionate trait can still be compassionate, because that can just be the thing, but it's not a defining trait for them. They can be fairly ambivalent. They can lean towards being more compassionate, but they aren't, by definition, one of the most compassionate people out there unless they have the trait. In CK2, anybody could have so many traits, everybody was practically everything. Now in CK3, that will differ. Only the most vital, the most natural definitions of the personality of the character that you're playing will actually show up as traits. And this is really important because it means that stress doesn't build up if a character that isn't compassionate or cruel, does something slightly mean. They will just be like, yeah, I really lean like either way, like it's fine. But if you are a very compassionate person and you insult one of your vassals, then you will be like, oh man, that really stresses me out. I don't like doing that. I did not enjoy that. And I think that is really, really neat. Because by limiting the amount of traits, you actually open up so many alleys to roleplay in other ways, because our characters then can have a bit of a headcanon going on. If I'm not compassionate or cruel, I can tell myself, hey, you know what, I lean towards this decision. I lean towards this inclination when it comes to being cruel or not being cruel. I think this is a much better choice. I think this actually is much better for roleplay because it won't limit you, with some of the myriad of the traits that you have. Now let's take a look at this. She is a compassionate character, our dear Matilda, and if she were to execute her prisoner, Countess Mariana of Arezzo, she would gain 42 stress. Now earlier we pointed out, one stress level is 100 points. Gaining 42 stress points is significant, very significant, and you can see that is a critical increase. I assume that if you execute someone and you are not compassionate, you will gain a small amount of stress, maybe like 10 or something. Taking the life of someone is not an easy choice. So that, of course, should also have an impact in stress, although definitely not as critical. Now, what is interesting here to me is that you have to spend 100 piety, and I assume that is because she's probably in your realm, she's probably your same religion, but 100 piety is a very significant amount. And the way I feel about this is probably because if you were to be cruel, or, a sadist, for example, you wouldn't get stressed out, you would lose stress. And losing stress is such a big boon that they said, you know what, so that you can't abuse that and constantly be at 0 stress as a cruel character, we're going to give you the cost of piety. I think this makes perfect sense. It's a huge... Listen, it was a rarity back in the day to see royalty executed. It was so damn rare. Because especially, when royalty would do that, if royalty were to execute other royalty, it would be for high crimes. Because the general assumption was, I don't execute you, you don't execute me. That's the privileges that we have as nobility. If you breach that, agreement essentially, that privilege, that means that someone might breach it towards you. And people didn't want that. So this is quite the rare thing. 100 piety seems very accurate, 20 dread, quite significant, and then again, the stress. Now this is interesting, because if you gain 42 stress, that is almost half of a stress level. There are other sources of stress too though. Being locked up in the dungeon of another character will gradually increase stress over time, as the isolation and neglect take their toll in a psyche. Other causes include overwork or the death of a loved one. Regardless of the source, once a character accumulates enough stress to pass a certain threshold and gain a stress level, they will suffer from a mental break. Now we're going to talk about the dungeon in a second, so I'm not going to approach that right now, but I really like that there are direct decisions that you take that give you stress or take stress from you, and then there will be, just the life circumstances of your character. For example, I could assume if you were constantly at war, that would also stress you out, unless you were a very war-minded character. I could also see that, if you, for example, were excommunicated, that might stress you out. I mean, being excommunicated from the church, from the one unifying institution in all of Europe, that gotta be stressful, unless, you are a very cynical person. But I really like that as well, because it makes it so that the game takes into account and has a mechanic that applies itself whenever you have changing life circumstances. Now, let's say you reach level 1 of a stress. Not of a stress, but of the stress level. What happens next? Mental breaks are a special kind of event which occurs when stress overwhelms a character and compels them to do something, anything, to gain relief. Exactly what type of mental break a character is depends heavily on their personality traits, and each one gives the character several options for dealing with the situation they have found themselves in. Let's examine this. Guilt and shame have been plaguing me as of late. All of my sins, my flaws, my failings, these dark thoughts distract me from my responsibilities and keep me awake at night. I feel like I must do something to put an end to this mental anguish, but what could possibly help? So, Matilda is slightly stressed out. You know, she says, oh, I'm a very sinful person, and now she has options to cope with this. This is interesting because apparently the game realizes what caused your stress, and by knowing what caused your stress, has answers to that stress that are unique to that form of stress. So, because it is the sinful life of Matilda here, the sting of the lash will excise my sins, so she could, you know, use a flagellant, she could become a flagellant and essentially punish herself when she prays, and that makes it so that she loses stress, but she also becomes wounded because she hit a bit too much. And then here's a very, very interesting tidbit. If you are still stressed in 5 years, you may suffer another mental break. I love that, because here is essentially what this system tries to emulate. If in 5 years you look back and say, I am still the same horrible person, even if you didn't go up to stress level 2, which of course would require then another mental break because every level that you reach gives you a mental break, but even if you don't get any higher, you are still slightly stressed. And you still being slightly stressed is you looking backwards and saying, oh my god, I'm still the same horrible person. God didn't grant me any support. I'm still left alone. I'm still, for example, I don't know, you know, let's say lustful. Maybe that is why she is freaking out here. So she's looking back and she's saying, I didn't become any better. And that is something that is such a natural process in humans, wanting to look back and wanting to see that they developed as a person, that they developed into something better. I think this is really, really neat because it encourages roleplay for you to cope, for you to deal with whatever is giving you stress, but it also encourages the min-maxer to roleplay a character. So roleplay being something that is natural, because otherwise you will suffer another mental break, is really, really good in my opinion. It makes it so that there is no longer divergence between you, you know, roleplaying and you min-maxing. It's the same thing, because if you don't roleplay, then you're not min-maxing. I really like this idea of making it so that stress sticks around and stress will further punish you unless you get rid of the stress, be it by coping or by getting rid of the source of the stress. So let's take a look at this. The sting of the lash will excise my sins, of course. Then the other option would be donating to charity will make up for my sins. So essentially her donating, being a bit too charitable maybe, will leave her, you know, a bit less stressed, but probably make it so that her coffers are quite a bit less full. And then we have, I must be strong and resist these impulses. So I think, and I believe this is confirmed later down, let's just go there later, but I just want to say what I think what I thought when I read that. I believe that if you don't like a character, let's say I am a very kind person, but I actually want to play a very cruel, a dreadful person. If I manage my stress, but always pick these options and still manage to push my stress down, I believe that eventually you will be able to get rid of whatever trait you wanted to get rid of. For example, if I'm kind and I make it so, you know what, being kind, this sucks. You know, you can live without a coping mechanism and eventually just drop the kindness. Just realize that the world is cruel and, you know, get out of this. This is quite interesting. This makes it so that you don't have a coping mechanism. It could also, of course, be that you at the end of the day end up with a situation where you say, I just don't want the coping mechanism, that's a crutch. I'm gonna like survive this without the coping mechanism, but of course the higher stress level makes it more likely that your character will suffer even further. But this is a really cool mechanic. The options that you have are specific to the stress that you are experiencing and give you a lot of options in terms of actual coping mechanisms to choose. Not all mental breaks are equal, and the severity of the mental break will depend on your stress level when the event occurs. A level 1 mental break may cause a wrathful character to yell at one of their vassals in front of the whole court, insulting them and wounding their pride. But a tier 3 mental break may instead drive that same character to murder their chosen heir in a fit of rage. Tier 3 stress, just so that we understand it, is a horribly, horribly stressed person. A person that, you know, when you talk to them, they will immediately shout at you. They're so angry, they're so constantly on edge. They're almost done. A level 1 stressed person is essentially just an annoyed person. I think that is the scale that we can apply here. Very, very cool. In addition to difference by stress level, some mental breaks are influenced by the situation you find yourself in. As an example, characters who are locked up in a dungeon cell will suffer from completely different mental breaks, often of greater severity, some of which can radically change their personality. And here we have the radical personality change. If you are stressed out enough that your lifestyle doesn't really cope well anymore at all with your personality will change. So for example, and this is very specific because we are in a prison, by the way, I understand why this exists, this grid here, the prison cell. It looks weird though. Matilda, just step Step aside. What's the big deal? Just step aside. Anyway, locked up here, I'm supposed to be weak and pacified, huh? Here in the darkness, I gather my strength and tear my enemies limb from limb with my mind. Over and over again. Every day they are reborn, and every day I destroy them like the vermin they are. Especially my wretched jailer, Emperor Heinrich. He will suffer the most. When I get out of this, oh, they will pay. This changes your personality. You stop being diligent because all of your life was focused on being diligent, of course, but now it's focused on vengeance. You will become vengeful, and you will destroy Emperor Heinrich IV. You will lose stress, 39, pretty decent. If you're still stressed in 5 years, you may suffer another mental break. We've seen that before. This is Kaiser Heinrich IV right here. I did read that Kaiser Heinrich was a very party-oriented noble until, you know, Canossa, etc., etc. So, like, look at this young fella. He does have, you know, a heavy crown, of course, on his head, but at the same time, he looks ready to party. And then on here we have, why wait, in my mind, they are at my mercy. This, a bit of a lunacy. It does look to me like insomnia, but because it's like the moon, right? But I don't know. It seems like coping with slight insanity. Not properly going insane, I don't think, but with slight insanity. And then if you don't want to cope, if you want to say, no, I'm not breaking. I will keep being who I am. This is wrong, I'm better than this. You can reject this entire idea. You can reject changing your character, and you can reject coping. You can just say, you know what, I'm going to deal with this in other ways. Very, very interesting set of decisions, because it essentially gives you a very different way of playing, no matter who you are, whether you're a role player or someone that min-maxes, whether you are a role player that likes playing someone that is diligent and not vengeful, or whether you're a role player that maybe really wants to play a vengeful character instead of a diligent one. Very, very nice that these decisions actually have an impact and are absolutely not random. Again, one of the main things that I think are wrong in the CK2 stress system, and it's not really even a system, but in everything defining your traits, your character, and whether you're stressed, is that there's so much randomness added. At some point, your character just wakes up and says, you know what? I'm depressed. It just happens. Like, that's the thing. People become depressed for certain circumstances. It is a highly complex issue. It is a highly delicate issue, of course. But it is something that doesn't just, nobody's just, you know, just be yourself. That's not how it goes. And writing these stories with your characters are really, really good. That is something that CK2 did never do. Wasn't really able to do. They tried with the PTSD. You know, if you are in a battle and you don't challenge the commander, there's a chance that you then become kind of well, essentially suffer a mental break later on. I think that is essentially how it can be described. But in that mental break, you just have 4 choices. That's all you do. There is no, like, in-between stages. CK3 is so much better about this. Seriously, I love this system. It reminds me a lot about, I mean, obviously Darkest Dungeon, all those games. Like, there's many games that use it, I guess. But there is a certain system for tabletop, you know, like Dungeons and Dragons and the like, but not Dungeons and Dragons, that's its own system. Blades in the Dark uses a vice system where essentially you gain stress as a character, and whenever you gain a lot of stress, you will, in the downtime, you know, between missions, you essentially sit down and say, I will indulge in my vice. For example, I will go drink, I will go whore around, all of those different things. That is really, really cool. It's a really good system in Blades in the Dark, and it's a really good system in CK3. Again, balancing, you know, notwithstanding. Let's move on. Regardless of what kind of mental break they suffer from, all mental breaks give the afflicted character the opportunity to lose a large amount of stress. Many of these options will also grant the afflicted character a coping mechanism trait, which will help them relieve stress in the future and thus reduce the likelihood of having additional mental breaks. Let's take a look at this. Coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms are traits that represent the long-term methods characters have developed to deal with stress of their life. Most of them impose some form of minor penalty on a character's skills, but in exchange, they will enhance the potency of all forms of stress loss. So Rakish, Matilda spent so much time in the brothel that it has become her second home. She's no longer as attractive, but, you know, other rakish characters say, hey, you're like me. Then you have a passive stress loss, so this just makes it so that you are less stressed in general, and you lose diplomacy but gain intrigue. Then we have drunkard, of course. You can see the penalties here are a bit harsher, of course, because you are constantly wasted, or at least buzzed, you know, whatever floats your boat, I guess. And then opinion of other drunkard characters, of course, they can stick together. Flagellant, right here, gives you negative prowess, gives you a health penalty. I think this is quite significant in comparison to this one, for example. And then Comfort Eater, stewardship goes down and stress loss goes up. Now, all of those coping mechanisms, don't just have the passive bonus, but they also have certain decisions. In addition to the passive effects of each trait, each one also enables a unique decision characters can take to indulge in their vice and relive a portion of their relieve a portion of their accumulated stress. Visit a brothel, for example. It was pointed out in this thread, and it's not incorrect. A man on my lap and everything and everyone. The brother has to offer at my beck and call. Nothing relieves the mind like some calm relief. I think this text was essentially written for male characters and probably should be rewritten. I don't think men sitting on women's laps. I mean, it might be correct. I mean, you know, whatever floats your boat, I guess. But I think that could be a different flavor text. But flavor text aside, you will lose some stress. Such wanton behavior has inherent risks. This might even, you know, it might injure you. Maybe, and this is something that I'm not sure about, but it would be cool and it could be implemented. I could see this if it's not known that you go to the brothel. If there is a way to hide these sort of coping mechanisms, this could become a small hook. This could become a small secret of yours that somebody can find out about and say, I will reveal your nature unless you do something for me. I don't know whether that is true because we don't actually know what it means. I assume that it means maybe you will just get injured in, you know, the act. But it could also, in my opinion, it should also possibly, certain coping mechanisms should also lead to secrets that then can be turned into hooks and that can then be used. Visit a brother will be unavailable for 3 years. So that's a lot of course, you know, that is a lot of downtime, but you want it to be somewhat balanced so that you in every 3 years can kind of cope with your stress. Again, good for min-maxes, good for role players. As a role player, I would, for example, sometimes say, oh, you know what, if I want to lose this coping mechanism, if I want to let go of this sinful behavior, then I'm not going to press the button. No matter how good the stress loss is, I'm not going to do it. And long term, this might even be the same as what a min-maxer does, because maybe long term that makes it so that my, you know, my vice and my personality will come at, or will be at peace with itself and make it so that I can remain at a low stress level. I think this is a really good mechanic to unify min-maxing. And I know I've said this numerous times, but it's really important. Oh, I almost broke my keyboard there, but it's really important to me that we essentially unify min-maxing and role-playing to a certain degree, because role-playing shouldn't ever be the wrong choice. It should be the right choice for your character, even if it is objectively a questionable choice. And if it's the right choice for a character, that should at least coincide, at least run, you know, somewhat close to being the right choice overall. Min-maxing, right? I think that's quite interesting. I really like that. Now let's move on. Regardless of the form it takes, all coping mechanisms are useful in one form or another. Having the ability to make stressful decisions at will is often more useful than a few extra points of diplomacy or stewardship, and each coping mechanism a character acquires makes it progressively easier for them to manage their stress. Of course, we saw that up here. If you have 2 of these, for example, you have plus 40% stress loss. That is really significant. Is it really worth it to execute that foreign claimant? When doing so will give you 42 stress. No, I jumped. Coping mechanism a character acquires makes it progressively easier. Here we go. Sorry. It is expected that most rulers will acquire 1 or 2 coping mechanisms during their lifetime, though in some rare circumstances a character may end up with more. This is big to me because it means that you shouldn't try to stay away from coping mechanisms unless you're, for example, role-playing a very, you know, diligent, maybe even religious character that tries to stay as true to the book or whatever their writing is, try to stay as true to their religion as they can. Maybe you don't want to become a drunkard or a flagellant, or maybe you want to become a flagellant actually, but maybe not a drunkard, maybe not, you know, whoring around, that sort of stuff. I think this is interesting because it is expected that you get coping mechanisms. Everybody in real life has some sort of coping mechanisms. I mean, you know, smoking, drinking, there's so many different vices that you can essentially say, hey, this is how I deal with life. And I think that's very interesting because it means that under very rare circumstances you might avoid it altogether, but in general you will interact with the system, no matter who your character is. You will interact with it in different ways, but you will. Now, let's move on with strategic considerations. As developers, our goal with the stress system is not to prohibit or punish players for taking certain actions, but rather to make them think twice about otherwise no-brainer decisions. Is it really worth it to execute that foreign claimant? When doing so will give you 42 stress? Maybe, but maybe not. That is a decision you will need to make when the time comes. This is really cool. Because it, again, as I said, sometimes the min-maxing and the roleplay choice will be the same. And that is something that the old CK2 system never achieved. You taking, for example, the decision to, you know, when you have the PTSD decision in CK2, if you already have children, there's no downside to you taking a celibacy oath, you know, becoming celibate. There's no downside. So everybody would just take that choice, unless you roleplay. But when you roleplay, you will give yourself worse traits, things will be worse in general for you. Meaning min-maxing and role-playing were very far apart in that decision. Now this one, it depends on the situation. It depends on how you view your character, how your character views themselves, and how you view your chances to recover from the 42 stress. I think really, really neat design decision, really, really neat design concept. Again, the balancing will be something different, of course. In this way, stress also gives us another tool we can use to balance the various personality traits against each other. Some traits, like ambitious and compassionate, may have higher numerical bonuses, but they cause you to acquire stress more frequently or in larger amounts. Others, like sadistic, may make your vassals loathe you, but your character won't be bothered by pesky concerns like morality when they have to do what needs to be done. Who knows, they might even enjoy it. And then we go down here and see a stress gain when you're diligent is plus 20%, whereas here when you're lazy it's plus 15% down, so your stress loss, that is. I think this is really neat. I think this is really, really well done. And what is also interesting, actually, lazy characters don't actually dislike diligent characters. Only diligent characters dislike lazy characters. Poor lazies. They are hated, but they don't have strong opinions of anyone. Yeah, and in this case, they said this earlier, but in this case, if you mismanage stress, that doesn't mean game over, it doesn't mean a loss, it just means that your character has a hard time in life. So let's take a look at this right here. Domain of debauchery. My liege, begs the servant, won't you please do something? Roma burns, you must send aid. I stretch, both my hands coming into contact with beautiful young flesh effortlessly. A chorus of moans behind me seem unbothered by the visitor. I believe I gave strict instructions not to be disturbed, I reply. Only this room, this reality will make sense to my fraying mind anymore. Makes sense to my fraying mind anymore. So he's obviously going insane. I mean, he's clearly going absolutely crazy. Bring me a companion and I'll send a relief. What is this? Tell me what... I can't zoom in any further. What is this? Oh my god. Can you... You know, isn't this wild? What the hell is this symbol? I don't know. Maybe it's just actual insanity. Ready, Barrel of the Best. I'll emerge soon. That's drunkard, of course. And then let them all burn. Because you're crazy. You are insane. I think this is Franconia. I cannot believe that they would slender a region like Franconia, of Bavaria, of course, like this. They're all sane, I swear. And now, either way, this is really, really neat. This is really cool, and it can lead to different character stories. Taking a lot of stress, if you're role-playing, doesn't mean that your character will, you know, take away all of your opportunities, but it will mean that your character will have unique roleplay opportunities added to that, and sometimes, you know, maybe killing all of those heirs or all of those claimants that would have come for you is the better choice, even if it costs you your mind. Again, very, very cool system. This is super impressive. It reminds me of so many other systems, but this one is a first for a grand strategy game. Honestly, for a roleplay game as a first, you know, sort of thing that we have in Darkest Dungeon, etc. But of course, Darkest Dungeon, it uses it as a numerical game mechanic. It doesn't really do it in terms of roleplay. Like, it doesn't really matter, you know, as a player, you min-max there anyway. But the roleplay degree here in the system is huge, whereas the min-max degree is completely compatible with it. It's really nice how it fits those two together, because no matter how you view your character, you will see the results of your life in that character's face. And I mean, this character looks very odd. But, let me just check something here. Right, I really don't know about this. I have a bad feeling to be forced to play some kind of character which I do not want to. Sure, in some games I enjoy to play like the character stats, however in others I don't. And the answer of the developer, Baron von Schoos, here is, we put a lot of effort into making the system flexible. For starters, as a ruler you still have a good deal of sway over the personality traits your children acquire. This helps ensure your heir doesn't end up with any personality traits that you really don't want to play with. There are also a number of mental breaks which can alter a character's personality. If their traits are causing them to frequently gain stress, you may end up acquiring a completely different set of personality traits. This is what I was suggesting earlier. If you, instead of coping, say, you know what, I'll keep on hammering, I'll keep on going, I'll keep gaining stress, your character eventually will drop that personality trait and exchange it for something else. Finally, even with a personality trait which doesn't match, you should never really feel forced or railroaded into doing anything you don't want to. If you find yourself wanted to take a lot of stressful actions, that's fine, you will just end up needing to offset them with various coping mechanisms. Very, very cool. This is one of those, and yeah, dogs, by the way, chop liquor here takes away some stress of yours. But I will tell you straight up, this mechanic is amazing because it actually manages to unify the needs of min-maxes and the needs of role players. I am so goddamn excited for this game. To see these mechanics in action, I am very, very happy that they were so brave to refine systems like this one into a fully designed mechanic instead of just, you know, a slightly event-driven mechanic. Now that you have the stat and everything going on, now that the mental well-being of your character is so important, I think the game will be significantly more enhanced in the roleplay aspect. Everybody, take care. Mentally, of course, of your mental well-being. Don't reach stress level 3, it would be bad. But also, if you enjoyed this video, consider becoming a member of the channel, because they are making videos such as this one possible. Namely, in this case, the Barons Achilles, Know-How, Charlie, Eterna, Falling Phoenix, Rex Romanorum, Jacob, the Musiala, Rodan, Florian, MFA, Mitchell, Aaron, Stefan, and Snivell. Then, of course, also the Counts, Lachlan, Kazan, Wombat, Thomas, and Shifty. And last but not least, the absolutely beautiful Dukes, Eric, Kiriana, Goodfield, Nathan, Jack, Kenneth, Evil Duck, and Lex. So, thank you all so much for supporting the channel directly. I will see you later. Alligator.